She smiled at me at the wedding and said, "Mama, I am so happy to be part of this family." 3 years later, I found out she had taken out $47,000 worth of loans in my name. And she thought I would never find out. She thought I was just a tired old woman sitting alone in a house in Kentucky who would not notice, would not fight back, would not follow it all the way to a courtroom. She thought wrong. You know, people always say, trust your gut. I have heard that my whole life. Trust your gut, Cordelia. Listen to your instincts. Well, my gut was screaming at me from the very first Sunday she sat at my dinner table. Screaming in that quiet, persistent way that something deep in your body knows the truth before your mind is willing to catch up to it. And I told myself, Cordelia, you are just being a difficult old woman. You are just being too protective of your boy. You have always been too watchful, too careful, and maybe that was good when Roland was little, but he is a grown man now and he does not need his mama second-guessing the woman he loves. So I silenced that voice. I swallowed it down with my sweet tea. And I smiled across the table and I welcomed her with open arms and a heart that was genuinely trying to be open. And every single time I did that, every single time I chose love over instinct, she took that love and she used it like a tool, like a hammer she had picked up specifically because she knew it would fit in my hand and I would not see it coming. But I am getting ahead of myself. I always tell my former students, when you are going to tell a story worth telling, start from the beginning. The real beginning, not the dramatic part, not the crisis, not the moment everything fell apart. Start from the ground, start from the roots, because the roots are what tell you why the tree grew the way it did. So let me start from the roots. My name is Cordelia June Whitfield, and I am 87 years old. I was born right here in Harlan County, Kentucky, in a little farmhouse that my grandfather built with his own 2 hands back in 1909. The man was not an architect. He was not a carpenter by trade. He was a man who needed shelter for his family and who had enough stubbornness and enough faith to build it himself, out of wood he cut from the hillside and nails he ordered from a catalog that took 3 weeks to arrive. That house stood for 8 decades through Kentucky, winters and summer floods and more hardship than I could list in an afternoon. It finally came down in a bad winter storm in the 90s. Just collapsed under the weight of ice like it had finally decided it had held enough. But I can still see every room of it in my mind as clear as if I were standing inside it right now. I can see the wide plank floors that creaked in the morning, a different creak for every board, so that my mama always knew when any of us was up before, daylight trying to sneak to the kitchen for something sweet. I can see the kitchen window that looked out over what used to be tobacco fields when my grandfather farmed them and what became just a green hillside by the time I was growing up there. I can see the wood stove that was the heart of the whole house in winter, orange light flickering through the iron grates, and the way the whole family would drift toward it in the evenings like planets orbiting something warm. I can smell the biscuits and the wood smoke that seemed to have soaked into the very walls over so many decades that they became part of the house itself. I grew up in that house with my mama and my daddy and 4 brothers. I was the second youngest and the only girl, which meant 2 things in our house. It meant I was sometimes overlooked in the chaos of all those boys, and it meant I had learned by the time I was 6 years old how to make myself heard in a room full of people who were not necessarily listening. Both of those skills have served me well over 87 years. My daddy worked in the coal mines. Most men in Harlan County worked in the coal mines in those years. It was the work the county was built on, dangerous and dark and necessary, and the men who did it carried something in their chests that was not just coal dust. It was a particular kind of dignity that comes from doing hard work because it has to be done, and not because anyone is going to congratulate you for it. My daddy never complained about the work, not once that I heard. He came home every evening with black around his eyes and under his fingernails, and he washed up at the sink and sat down at the table and asked every one of us, children, what we had learned that day. Every single day. What did you learn today? He believed in learning the way some people believe in church, completely and without reservation. My mama was the kind of woman who could stretch $1 further than anyone I have ever known before or since. She could make a meal out of what most people would have thrown away. She could sew a dress out of feed sacks that you could not distinguish from something store-bought if you were not looking too close. She kept our house clean and our family together through lean years and hard years. And she did it without drama, because drama was not something she had time for. She was the most practical woman I have ever known, and I have tried to be like her every day of my life. From the very start, I was the one in that family with the books. While my brothers were out working the land with my daddy on weekends and summers, learning the physical rhythms of farming and fixing and hauling, I was inside reading everything I could get my hands on. The county had a small library in town, and I walked there every Saturday, and I walked home with as many books as they would let me carry. My mama used to say, "Cordelia, if you spend any more time with those books, your eyes are going to fall right out of your head." But she smiled when she said it. And she walked to the library herself sometimes, and she brought home books for me that she thought I would like. She never said that out loud. She would just leave them on the kitchen table without comment, and I would understand. By the time I was in high school, I knew I was going to be a teacher. I did not know how I was going to manage it financially. I did not know what obstacles were going to be in the way. I just knew it the way, certain things that are so true, they do not feel like a decision. They feel like a fact about yourself that you are only now discovering, rather than choosing, I was going to teach. The question was just the path to get there. I went to Eastern Kentucky University on a scholarship that covered part of my tuition. The rest I covered by working 3 jobs. I worked in the university cafeteria in the mornings before class. I cleaned dormitory bathrooms on the weekends. I tutored other students in the evenings for $1 an hour, which sounds like nothing now but was something then. I did all of this without complaint, because my daddy had gone into the coal mines every day of my childhood without complaint, and I figured if he could do that for his family, then I could do this for myself. I came back to Harlan County with my teaching degree and a fire in my chest that I thought would never go out. And it never did. I want to say that clearly because people sometimes assume that 41 years of anything will burn you out eventually. 41 years of teaching 3rd graders and 4th graders and 5th graders in a rural Kentucky county. With all the challenges that comes with the limited resources and the difficult home situations some of those children were coming from, and the heartbreak of watching a child with so much potential get pulled under by circumstances beyond anyone's control. People assume that burns you out, but it never burned me out. It burned differently over the years, sometimes lower and sometimes brighter, but it never went out. I taught reading and writing and arithmetic, and I taught those children something that no textbook could ever really capture, which was that they mattered. That where they came from did not determine where they were going. That a child from a holler in Harlan County, Kentucky, a child whose daddy worked in the mines and whose mama stretched every dollar to its limit, could grow up to do anything in this wide world if somebody believed in them hard enough and long enough and refused to stop believing no matter what. I tried to be that somebody for every single child who sat in my classroom. I do not know how well I succeeded. I know I tried with everything I had. Let me tell you about a few of those children because they deserve to be part of this story. There was a boy in my 3rd grade class in 1969, small, quiet boy from up on one of the ridges. His family had almost nothing, who could barely read when he came to me in September, and who was reading 2 years, above grade level by June. He came back to visit me when he was in high school, and again when he was in college. He became an engineer. He sent me a Christmas card every single year until I retired and a few years after. I still have a stack of those cards somewhere in the spare room. I could not throw them away. There was a little girl in my 4th grade class in the mid-1970s, bright and restless and difficult, in the way that very smart children are often difficult when the work is not challenging enough for them. Her mother thought she had a behavior problem. Her previous teacher thought she was a disruption. I thought she was bored, and I treated her accordingly. I gave her harder work and more responsibility in the classroom, and she rose to every bit of it. She became a doctor. She came back and told me years later that I was the First person who ever told her that being difficult was a form of intelligence that just needed direction. I think about her when I am having a hard day. There was a boy in my 5th grade class in 1983 whose home situation was terrible in ways I will not detail here because some stories are not mine to tell. He came to school some mornings with hungry eyes and quiet hands, and I learned to keep extra breakfast food in my desk drawer for the mornings when I could see he had not eaten. The school had a social worker, but resources were limited, and the systems that should have helped that child were slow and inadequate and sometimes just absent. I did what I could inside my classroom, which was to make it a place where he was safe and fed and told every single day that he was smart and that he had a future. I do not know where he ended up. Some of the children you lose track of and you carry that not knowing with you. Those are the children I taught. Those are the lives I tried to touch. 41 years of them. And when I retired, and people asked me if I was going to miss it, I said I was going to miss it every day of my life, and I have been right about that. I miss it still. I met Chester Whitfield at a church social in the summer of 1961. He was 24 years old and I was 23, and he was the quietest man in the room, which is saying something, because church socials in Harlan County were not known for quietness. He was standing near the food table with a plate of deviled eggs and a look on his face like he was waiting patiently for the whole event to be over, not unhappily, just patiently, the way a man waits for rain to pass. I walked over and stood next to him because something about that patience drew me. And he said, without looking at me first, "They always put too much mustard in these deviled eggs." And I said, "Well, that is a strong opinion for a man who is eating his 3rd one." And he looked at me then and smiled. And that was the beginning of everything. Chester drove a coal truck for 30 years. He hauled coal out of the mountains and delivered it where it needed to go, and he did it with the same steady reliability that he brought to everything in his life. Chester was not a flashy man. He was not a man who needed to be the center of anything. He was a man who showed up and did what needed doing and came home to his family and meant every single thing he said. I have known many people in 87 years of living, and I have not known many people I could say that about fully and without qualification. Chester was one of them. We were married in 1962, and we moved into a small rented house in Harlan, and we built our life there piece by piece. Roland was born in 1964. 2 years after our wedding, my boy came into the world on a cold January morning when the roads were iced over, and Chester drove 40 miles an hour the whole way to the hospital with his jaw set and his hands steady on the wheel. And when they put that baby in my arms, I understood for the first time what it means to have your heart walking around outside your body. Let me tell you about Chester and me because I think our marriage is worth describing properly, not just in summary. 49 years with one person is a long time, and what you build over that time is its own complicated and beautiful and sometimes frustrating thing that is unlike anything else in a life. Chester and I were not the same kind of people. I was the talker and he was the listener. I was the one who processed feelings out loud, and he was the one who processed them quietly in some interior room I was never fully invited into, but which I learned to respect. I was the one who needed to name things, and he was the one who was comfortable with things remaining unnamed. You would think those differences would cause friction, and sometimes they did, but mostly they complemented each other in a way that made both of us more complete. Chester was a man who showed his love through action rather than words. He showed it by getting up before sunrise to warm up my car on cold mornings when he did not have to be up himself, by fixing the classroom things I brought home in the evenings without being asked, by remembering without being told what I needed and making sure it was there. He showed it by coming to every school event for 41 years, every recital and every award ceremony and every open house, sitting in those little chairs made for children and being genuinely interested in the children. I talked about and remembered their names from one year to the next. He showed it by sitting next to me on the porch in the evenings without needing to say anything, just being there, being present, which I have come to understand is one of the rarest gifts one person can give another. I loved that man with everything I had for 49 years, and I love him still. The missing of him is quieter now than it was in the first years, but it is no smaller. It has just become part of the texture of daily life. The way the absence of something you always had becomes simply part of the landscape. You stop expecting to hear the truck in the driveway, and then the absence of that expectation becomes its own kind of presence. We bought the house on Clover Creek Road in 1978. Roland was 14, and he thought the big oak tree in the backyard was the best thing that had ever happened to him. He climbed it every day that first summer. Chester and I paid on that house for 24 years, and we paid it off completely in 2002. The day we made that last payment, Chester sat at the kitchen table and looked at the paperwork for a long time, and then he folded it carefully and put it in the fireproof box we kept under the bed. And he said, "Well, Cordy, it is ours now." And I said, "It has always been ours, Chester." And he said, "I know, but now nobody can take it." And I understood what he meant by that. A man who grew up in coal country, with a father who lost work during strikes, and a family who went hungry some winters, understands in his bones what it means to have something that cannot be taken. That house being paid off meant security in a way that went deeper than finance. It meant permanence. It meant we had built something that would stand. Chester passed in 2011. Heart attack in his sleep on a Tuesday night in November. The doctor said he likely did not suffer. He was there when we went to sleep, and he was gone when I woke up, and there is a mercy in that I have tried to hold onto even through all the grief of it. He was 73 years old. He had lived a full and decent life, and he had been my companion for 49 years, and when he was gone, the house on Clover Creek Road felt enormous in a way it had never felt before. All those rooms full of quiet. I retired from teaching in 2004 at 66 years old. Not entirely by choice. My knees had started giving me real trouble, and the doctor was very direct about it. The way good doctors are when they need you to actually listen. He said, "Cordelia, your body has been doing exceptional work for a long time, and it is telling you something right now, and if you do not listen to it, you are going to be having a very different conversation with me in 2 years." So I listened. I cleaned out my classroom, which took 3 full days, because 41 years of a teaching life accumulates in ways you do not fully realize until you are packing it all into boxes. 41 years of decorations and reference books and craft supplies and little gifts the children had made me over the decades. Clay handprints and construction, paper cards and drawings of my face that looked like various aliens, but which I treasured. Every single one of. I drove home to Clover Creek Road, and I started my retirement. And honestly, for the first couple of years, it was a real adjustment. Teaching had been the structure of my days for so long that without it, I felt a little unmoored. I gardened. I read. I visited with Dorothea and other friends. I kept the house the way I had always kept it. But there were stretches of quiet that were longer than I was used to and that I had to learn to sit with. After Chester passed in 2011, those stretches of quiet got longer still. Roland called every Tuesday evening without fail. Bless his heart. And I had friends, and I had Dorothea 2 roads over, and I had my garden and my books. But the house held a different quality of silence than it had before. Chester was gone. Not bad necessarily, just different. The silence of a life that has been large and is now smaller, not because anything has been lost from it, but because one of the main things that made it large is no longer there. I tell you all of this so you understand who I was when Priscilla came into my life. I was a woman who had built something real over 87 years. A woman of education and faith and hard work. A woman who had loved deeply and lost deeply and kept going. A woman living alone in a house she owned free and clear with a teacher's pension and social security and a modest savings account and credit that she had protected and maintained carefully her entire adult life because she understood from her parents what it cost to not have it. A woman who was, if I am being completely honest, a little bit lonely in the particular way that older people can be lonely without it being a crisis, just a background note in the music of your days. And Priscilla, I believe, could see all of that. I believe she was very good at seeing exactly that. Roland met Priscilla Dawn Sutton at a work function in Lexington in 2017. He was 53 years old, never been married, and I had made my peace with that years ago. Roland had dated over the years, a few relationships that seemed promising and then quietly ended, and I had stopped asking about his love life. Sometime in his 40s, because I could tell the questions made him tired. He was not unhappy. He was a man who had built a good life on his own terms and who was not, in a rush to change it. I respected that. So when he called me on a Tuesday evening in October of 2017 with a different quality in his voice, a lighter, faster, more alive quality that I recognized immediately, even though I had not heard it from him in years, I sat up straighter in my kitchen chair. He said, "Mama, I met somebody." And the way he said it, the whole weight of those 4 words, told me this was not a casual thing. This was not someone he was mentioning in passing. This was someone who had gotten into him the way that only happens a few times in a life if you are lucky. He talked about her for an hour and 40 minutes that night. I kept track because I was so happy listening that I did not want it to stop. I wanted to hold the whole conversation in my hands. He told me her name was Priscilla, that she worked in pharmaceutical sales, that she was smart and funny and confident in a way that he admired, that she had a laugh that could fill up a room. He told me she was from Bowling Green originally and that she had been on her own for a long time and that there was something in her, some quality of having made herself through her own effort, that he recognized and respected. He sounded like a man who had found something he had not known he was looking for. I was happy for him. Genuinely, deeply happy. Not the cautious, careful happy of a mother who is reserving judgment. The real thing. The kind that fills up your chest. He brought her down to Harlan County that December to meet me. I cooked for 2 days. Roast chicken and sweet potatoes and green beans. I had put up from the garden that summer and cornbread and 2 pies, apple and pecan, because I did not know which she preferred and I was not going to be the grandmother who did not offer both options. I cleaned the house until it shone. I wore my good blue dress, the one I kept for occasions that mattered. They pulled up on a cold Saturday afternoon in December, and I was watching from the kitchen window when they got out of the car. The car itself gave me my first little sideways moment, although I did not name it as that at the time. It was a late model SUV, dark blue, gleaming clean in a way that seemed particular for a muddy December road in rural Kentucky. Well-maintained, well-cared for, the kind of vehicle that told you something about how the person inside wanted to be perceived. That is not a judgment, necessarily. Plenty of good people drive nice cars. It was just a note I made without fully realizing I was making it. Priscilla herself was beautiful. Genuinely, undeniably beautiful in a way that was also somehow precise, like beauty that had been carefully managed rather than simply inherited. Dark hair, cut and styled just so. Green eyes that were striking enough that you noticed them first thing. A wool coat that fit perfectly. Boots that were stylish but not impractical. The overall impression was of a person who had thought very carefully about every element of how she appeared, which, again, is not automatically a character flaw. Plenty of careful people in this world. But there was something about the precision of it that my old teachers I filed away under the heading of things to watch. She hugged me at the door, came right in and wrapped her arms around me before I had even fully opened it, and said, "Cordelia, I have heard so much about you. You are every bit as wonderful as Roland said." And something in my chest went just a tiny bit sideways, like a picture frame that is almost level but not quite. And you keep looking at it, because something is off, but you cannot quite put your finger on what. I know now what it was. It was the performance of it. She had rehearsed that moment. She had decided before she ever got out of the car what she was going to say when she hugged me, and she said it perfectly. And the thing is, I have spent 41 years in a classroom watching children perform. Watching them perform understanding they did not have. Perform attention they were not giving. Perform emotions they thought were expected of them. I know the difference between a child who genuinely loves reading and a child who has learned that saying they love reading gets a warm response from the teacher. I know performance And what Priscilla did at my front door that December day was a performance. Not a bad one. A very good one, actually. But a performance nonetheless. But I did not act on that knowledge. Because what was I going to do? Tell my son that his girlfriend hugged me too enthusiastically? That something felt slightly rehearsed? That would have been absurd. And maybe I was wrong. I had been wrong before. I am not so proud that I cannot admit that. So I welcomed her in and we had dinner and it was lovely. She was charming throughout in a way that never felt overdone, which is itself an art. She helped clear the table without being asked, which I noticed. She complimented the food specifically and thoughtfully. Not just, oh, everything is delicious, but this. Cornbread has the perfect texture, and I have never had green beans put up this way. Did you add something to the brine? She asked me questions about my teaching career that seemed genuinely curious. She listened when I answered. She made eye contact. She laughed at the right moments. She was, in short, everything a woman could be when meeting her boyfriend's mother for the first time and hoping to be liked. And the thing is, I did like her, or I liked the version of her she showed me that day. I liked her intelligence and her humor and her attention. I thought Roland had made a good choice. I told him so when they left that evening, and I meant it mostly. The mostly is what I have thought about since. They dated through all of 2018 and got engaged in the spring of 2019. Roland called me to tell me, and his voice was the happiest. I had heard it since before his daddy passed. I sat in my kitchen and held the phone and felt tears coming down my face that surprised me a little. The good kind of tears. The ones that come when something you have hoped for a long time has finally happened. My boy was going to have a companion. My boy was going to have someone to build a life with. Someone to sit across the table from in the evenings. Someone to be his person. I wanted that for him so badly that I would have given almost anything for it. I realize now that in a certain sense I did give almost anything for it. The wedding was in September of 2019. Small, tasteful, held at a venue outside Lexington that Priscilla had found and arranged almost entirely herself. She was a capable planner, I will say that. Everything ran smoothly. The flowers were beautiful. The food was good. Roland stood at the altar, waiting for her, and he looked like a man who could not quite believe his luck. The genuinely good kind of luck. And when he saw her coming down the aisle, his face did something that I have thought about many times since. It opened. That is the only word for it. His face opened up completely. All the careful reserve he carried most of the time just dissolved. And what was underneath was pure, unguarded joy. I wore the blue dress and I cried, and I meant every tear. When Priscilla hugged me after the ceremony and said, "Mama, I am so happy to be part of this family," I pulled her close and I patted her back and I thought, "Welcome, baby. Welcome to this family. Whatever you were before, you are ours now." I have spent time since thinking about what was happening in her mind at that moment. Whether any of it was real, whether there was any genuine feeling mixed in with whatever calculation she was running, I honestly do not know. I hope there was. I hope that on that particular day at least, some part of her meant it. But I cannot know that. And dwelling on it too long leads nowhere useful, so I have tried to put the question to rest, even if it will not quite stay there. The first year of their marriage seemed fine from the outside. They were living in Lexington in a nice apartment, and when I visited at Thanksgiving that first year, they seemed at ease with each other, comfortable in the way of people who have found their rhythm together. There were small things I noticed, but did not name. A stiffness when money came up in conversation, a subject change that happened a little too smoothly. Priscilla mentioned a shopping trip, and Roland's expression shifted for just a moment before he recovered it. Small things. The kind of things you tell yourself you are imagining. I did not know then what I came to know later, that they had started having serious arguments about money almost immediately after the wedding, that Priscilla's spending was a constant source of tension, that she had tastes that ran well ahead of what their combined income could comfortably support. Roland made good money as an accountant, genuinely good money for Lexington, but he was also a careful saver with retirement in mind, and the idea of spending freely made him anxious in a fundamental way. Priscilla, it turned out, had a very different relationship to money. She wanted things and she was skilled at finding ways to get them. She quit her pharmaceutical sales job in March of 2020. The pandemic hit and she said the travel was impossible and the company was struggling, and she decided this was a good time to step back and figure out her next thing. Roland told me this carefully. The way he always told me things he was not sure how to frame, and I said that made sense given everything going on in the world and left it at that. The next thing never quite materialized. She did some consulting work that she mentioned vaguely from time to time. She worked on what she called her portfolio, which I understood to mean some kind of freelance work. But steady, regular employment did not come back. And as the months went on, I started to understand that this was not a temporary situation between opportunities, but a longer-term pattern. That summer, the summer of 2020, Priscilla started calling me. Just to chat, she would say. Just checking in. I want you to know in the spirit of full honesty that I loved it. I genuinely loved it. An old woman living alone will not pretend otherwise. Those calls meant something to me. They filled a space in my days that had been quiet for too long. We talked about everything and nothing, the way women do when they are getting comfortable with each other. She asked about my life and my memories. She asked about Chester, about what our marriage had really been like in the day-to-day of it. The real texture of 49 years with one person. She asked about my teaching years, wanted specific stories, wanted details. She seemed to delight in the stories from the early years especially. The 1960s and 70s, when things were so different and the challenges were so particular to that time and place. She asked about growing up in Harlan County, about my parents, my brothers, the farmhouse. She seemed genuinely moved by some of it, genuinely interested. And I talked. Lord, I talked. I told her things I had not talked about in years. Stories that were stored away not because they were painful, but just because the person who would have been most interested in hearing them was gone. Chester had been my person for telling stories to, and when Chester left, there was nobody to tell certain stories to anymore. And here was Priscilla, asking all the right questions, listening with her whole attention. Remembering what I had said last week and following up on it this week. She was building a portrait of me. I understand that now. She was learning every detail of my life with the focus and attention of someone who intended to use that information. She was learning the shape of my story so she could step into it, so she could become Cordelia June Whitfield on paper, so she could sit at a computer screen somewhere and answer questions about my life accurately enough to open credit accounts in my name. I did not know that then. Then I just felt seen. And that is the cruelest part of what she did. She took the thing that an old woman most wants and least expects, to be genuinely seen and known and interesting, to someone younger, who has their whole life ahead of them, and she used it as the instrument of the crime. I want to tell you about a specific phone call because I think it captures something important about how this worked. It was a Wednesday afternoon in August of 2020, and I had been in the garden all morning. And I came inside hot and tired, and my phone rang, and it was Priscilla. She said, Cordelia, tell me more about Chester. I was telling Roland the story you told me last week, about the time Chester got lost in the snowstorm driving back from Pikeville, and Roland said he had never heard that story, and I realized you have all these stories that Roland does not even know. Tell me the rest of it. So I told her the rest of the snowstorm story. Chester driving home in a white out in the winter of 1973. The truck sliding off the road on a curve up on Martin's Fork. Him walking 2 miles, through snow up to his knees to find a farmhouse where an old couple took him in and fed him and let him sleep on their couch. Then walking back out in the morning to find that some neighbor had already pulled his truck back onto the road. I told her how he came home, looking like a snowman, and I had run to the door, thinking something terrible had happened, and he had said, Cordy, everything is fine, I just had an adventure. That was Chester. Everything is fine, I just had an adventure. Priscilla laughed at the right moment. She said that sounds exactly like what Roland would say. And I thought, yes. Roland is like his daddy in that way, that steadiness, that way of minimizing the dramatic in the interest of not causing worry. And we talked for another 45 minutes after that, and when I hung up, I sat in my kitchen feeling warm all the way through, feeling like I had a daughter, like the family had grown. She was noting the details. The snowstorm. The year, the route. Chester's name and personality. All of it potentially useful for a profile of me that she might need to fill in convincingly when applying for credit in my name. Because lenders sometimes ask security questions, sometimes ask for additional identifying information. And the more she knew about my life, the better equipped she was to answer those questions if they arose. I found this out later from Detective Rains, who told me that one of the loan applications had included a verification call where someone, purporting to be me, had answered several questions about my background, questions about my address history, about my occupation, about a family member's name, all questions that Priscilla could have answered after months of careful listening to my afternoon phone calls. She came to stay at my house for Thanksgiving of 2020. Roland and Priscilla both came 4 nights, and it was a real Thanksgiving in the old sense. Cooking and eating and sitting around talking and watching the fire. I loved every minute of it. Priscilla was helpful around the house in ways that felt natural, not performative, or at least felt that way at the time. She washed dishes. She helped me put up the Christmas decorations early since they would not be back before Christmas. She sat with me in the evenings and talked while Roland watched football, and those conversations felt like the real thing, easy and unguarded. On the 3rd day, she asked if she could help me organize some of my paperwork. She said she was good at organization and that she noticed I had a lot of documents piled up on the desk in the spare room, and she would love to help me sort through them and get them into some kind of order. I told her that would be wonderful, and I got out my accordion file folder, the one where I keep all my important documents, my tax returns and my insurance papers, and my bank statements, and my social security card and my birth certificate and all the rest of it. The complete paper record of a life. We sat at the kitchen table together, and we started going through it. She was efficient and organized, knew how to create a system. We worked together for maybe half an hour, and then I started to get tired. Because that was mid-afternoon, and I sometimes fade a little in the mid-afternoon, and I said I was going to lie down for a little bit. I told her not to worry about finishing. We could do more tomorrow. And she said, no, please let me keep going. I want to do this for you. You rest, and I will finish up and have it all organized when you wake up. I went and took a nap. I was gone for about 45 minutes. When I came back, she had everything organized beautifully, labeled and sorted by category and by year. She had done a genuinely good job. I thanked her and meant it. In those 45 minutes, she had also, I believe, photographed or written down my social security number, my date of birth as it appeared on multiple documents, my full legal name, my address, my bank account information, my tax identification details, and anything else she might need to convincingly become me in an online loan application. She went home the next day and hugged me warmly at the door and said she had loved every minute of this visit. And I watched them drive away down Clover Creek Road, and I felt that particular combination of warmth and loss that comes at the end of a good visit. Happy for what it was, a little hollow now that it was over. I went back inside and I made a cup of tea and I sat in my kitchen and I felt, if I am being completely honest, genuinely lucky. Lucky to have a daughter-in-law who cared enough to drive 4 hours to spend Thanksgiving with an old woman in a house in rural Kentucky. Lucky to feel less alone. She drove home with everything she needed to steal my identity. Now I want to pause here for a moment and talk about something that I think is important for anyone listening to this story, because I know what some of you are thinking. You are thinking, how did you not see it? You are thinking, surely there were clearer signs. You are thinking that you would have known, that you would have caught it sooner, that something so calculated would have been obvious to any reasonably intelligent person. I used to think the same thing about the stories I heard before it happened to me. Here is what I want you to understand about skilled manipulation. It does not announce itself. A person who is truly skilled at using other people does not come in wearing the face of a villain. They come in wearing the face of exactly what you need them to be. They study you, sometimes for months, and they become whatever version of themselves will make you trust them most. They are warm when you need warmth. They are interested when you need to feel interesting. They remember the things you told them because those things are data points, and they reference those things back to you in ways that make you feel seen and known and cared for. The whole architecture of the relationship is built on what they have learned about your needs and your vulnerabilities and your particular kind of loneliness. And the cruelest part of it is that the better you are as a person, the more open and trusting and willing to love, the more effective the manipulation is against you. It is not the suspicious and closed-off people who get targeted this way. It is the warm ones, the ones who believe in people, the ones who still, at 87 years old, wake up in the morning willing to think well of the world. Priscilla was not a genius. She was not some criminal mastermind. She was a person who had found a particular method that worked on a particular kind of target, and she had practiced it enough to become very good at it. The method was simple at its core. Find someone lonely. Find someone with something worth taking. Become indispensable to them. Gain access. Use the access. Walk away. The reason it worked on me is not that I was stupid or naive or pathetic. The reason it worked on me, temporarily, is that I am a human being who wanted to love my son's wife and who opened myself to that love the way I have opened myself to every worthwhile thing in my life. Fully and without reservation, that is not a flaw. That is the best thing about me. And she used it. I know that now. And knowing it clearly, holding it in the light, is part of how I made sure she did not get to keep what she took. The letter arrived in February of 2021. A plain white envelope from a bank in Cincinnati with a return address I did not recognize. I get a fair amount of mail, being of an age where paper correspondence is still a significant part of life. So I opened it the way I open most things, without particular expectation. And I read it. And I read it again. And I set it down on the kitchen table and I sat very still. It was a welcome letter for a new personal loan. $15,000. Issued in my name to my address. Referencing my social security number. A loan I had absolutely not applied for, to a bank I had never had any dealings with in my life. My first reaction, I will admit, was a kind of blank confusion. Not panic, not anger, not even quite disbelief. Just a blankness, the mind temporarily unable to process something that does not fit the category of things it was expecting to process that day. I sat with that blankness for a few minutes, and then my teacher's mind started working again. The part that was trained over 41 years to assess a situation, clearly and without assumptions. I called the bank. I waited on hold for 20 minutes, which is its own particular form of misery, and then I spoke to a customer service representative who confirmed that yes, a personal loan had been opened in my name, with my social security number and date of birth and address, applied for online in January and approved and funded in February. The funds had been deposited into an account. When I asked which account, she said she could not give me that information over the phone, but that I should contact their fraud department if I believed the account was unauthorized. I told her I definitely believed that. I hung up and I went to my desk, and I got a yellow legal pad and I wrote the date at the top, and I wrote down everything the woman had told me, every detail, every reference number she had given me. Because I am a teacher, we document. Then I called the fraud department. More hold time? Then a longer conversation with someone more senior, who took my report seriously and told me what steps to initiate, freeze my credit, file a police report, gather any documentation I had, contact the credit bureaus. They would investigate on their end. Let me tell you something about what it actually feels like to go through the process of reporting identity theft, because people do not talk about it enough, and I think older folks especially deserve to know what it involves before it happens to them. It is not one phone call. It is not one form you fill out and hand in and wait for someone to fix it. It is dozens of phone calls across many weeks, each one requiring you to explain the whole situation from the very beginning to a new person who was not there for the last call, each one involving a different form or a different requirement. Each one conducted largely on hold, listening to recorded music that begins to feel, after the fourth or fifth hour of it, like a particular form of psychological endurance testing. It involves certified mail to multiple agencies and multiple credit bureaus with specific documentation attached. It involves disputes filed separately with each of the 3 major credit bureaus. It involves follow-up calls to confirm the disputes were received, and then more follow-up calls to check on investigation status, and then still more follow-up calls. Because sometimes the first follow-up call disappears into a void somewhere in the bureaucracy and you have to start again. It involves keeping a meticulous paper trail of every single step. Because if you do not keep that trail yourself, I promise you no one else is keeping it for you. I am 87 years old. I did every bit of it. I am telling you this not to make myself sound impressive, and not to complain about the system, though parts of that system could certainly stand to be easier to navigate for someone my age. I am telling you because somewhere, right now there is another older person sitting at a kitchen table with an unexpected letter in their hand and a sick feeling in their stomach, feeling overwhelmed and scared and maybe a little ashamed. And I want that person to hear from me directly that you can do this, one step at a time. Write it all down. Keep every paper. Make every call. Follow up on every follow-up. It is not easy, but it is absolutely possible, and it is absolutely worth doing. Do not let the size of the problem convince you that the problem cannot be addressed. I did all of those things that same day. I called the county sheriff's office, and a deputy named Hendricks came out to my house. Young man, 28 or 30, very respectful, took down everything I told him in a small notebook, asked good questions. He told me he would file the report and that the department would follow up. I still was not thinking about Priscilla. I want to be clear about that because it is important to the honesty of this story. My first instinct was phone scams. There had been stories about those for years. People calling elderly folks, pretending to be from the IRS or a bank, getting their information. I had always been careful. I thought I had been careful, but maybe I had slipped up somewhere, given something to someone who sounded official over the phone, and not fully registered what I was doing. I am 87 years old and I am sharp, but I am not infallible, and I know that. I went to bed that night with the situation, heavy in my mind, but with a working theory that felt manageable. A scam. A fraud perpetrated remotely by someone I had never met. Terrible, yes. Requiring work to address, yes, but impersonal. Not someone I had cooked Thanksgiving dinner for. The second letter came a week later. Louisville this time. A credit union I had never heard of. Another loan. $12,000. Same story, applied online in January. Approved in February. Funds deposited to an account that was not mine. I sat at my kitchen table and I stared at that second letter for a long time, and the working theory about a phone scam started to feel insufficient. Because the first letter could have been an opportunistic criminal who got lucky with my information somehow. But the second letter, coming from a completely different institution in a different city, applied for in the same window of time, suggested something more organized. Someone who had my information and was using it systematically. Someone who had taken the time to do this not once, but at least twice. Who had planned it out. Who knew what they were doing. I called Beverly at First National of Harlan. Beverly was the branch manager, had been for years, and she and I had a real relationship. The way you build with people, over decades of being in a small place together. I asked her if I could come in, and she said, of course, come right now. I drove into town and sat across her desk and told her everything I knew at that point. Beverly pulled up my full credit report right there, and we went through it together. Beverly reading and me listening, and the room getting smaller and smaller, around me with every line. 5 accounts opened in my name that I had not opened. 3 personal loans, 1 credit card account, and a personal line of credit. Opened in a window of time spanning October of 2020 through January of 2021. The total balance across all 5 was $47,300. Beverly held my hand across the desk, and she did not say the things people sometimes say in those moments. The things that are meant to be comforting but land wrong. The you will be okay and it will all work out. She said what needed saying, which was that this was serious and that she was going to help me through every step of it, and that we needed to start right now. I appreciated that more than I can say. I needed a practical partner in that moment, And Beverly was exactly that. Sitting in Beverly's office, I started to think more carefully about the source. Because whoever did this had my complete personal information, my social security number, my date of birth, my address, my full legal name exactly as it appears on official documents. They had not gotten that from a phone scam, or not just from a phone scam. A phone scammer might get your social security number if they are clever enough, but they would not necessarily have all the supporting details exactly right. The full name, the correct address formatting, all the small things that add up to a convincing identity. This had the feel of someone who had access to actual documents. Physical documents. The kind kept in an accordion file folder on a desk in a spare room in a house in rural Kentucky. And then, God forgive me for the grief it brought with it. I thought of Thanksgiving. I drove home from the bank and I sat in my car in the driveway under the bare oak tree, and I let myself think about it fully for the first time. I went through it step by step the way I would have walked a student through a logic problem. Who had access to my documents? When did the fraudulent accounts start being opened? What was the timeline of events? Priscilla had been at my house for Thanksgiving in late November of 2020. The fraudulent applications had been submitted starting in October of 2020, which meant the first one had actually been submitted before Thanksgiving. Which meant, wait, if the first application was in October and Priscilla was not at my house until November, then Thanksgiving was not the only opportunity she had had for my information. She had been in my house before. Roland had brought her for a weekend in September of 2020, just the two of them, while I had a doctor's appointment in the afternoon and was gone for 3 hours. 3 hours during which Priscilla was alone in my house. I had not thought twice about that at the time. Why would I? It was my son's wife in my house while I went to the doctor. I went inside and I got my composition notebook, which I had bought after the first letter, because I knew from 41 years of experience that when something complicated is happening, you write it down. I sat at my kitchen table and I wrote it all out. Every visit Priscilla had made to my house. Every occasion she might have had access to my documents or my personal information. Every conversation where my finances had come up, even in passing. Every inconsistency I had noticed in her stories about herself over the 2 years I had known her. I wrote for 2 hours. I filled 4 pages in my careful teacher's handwriting. And when I was done, I looked at what I had written and I felt 2 things. Simultaneously, the first was a cold clarity, the feeling of seeing something that had been blurry come into focus, not comforting but at least definite. The second was grief, deep, real, surprising grief, because I had cared about this woman. Whatever she was, whatever she had done, I had let her into my life and my stories, and I had thought we were building something real. Finding out that the care was manufactured is its own kind of loss, separate from the financial one. It is the loss of something you thought you had. I drove over to Dorothea's house. I needed to say it out loud to someone who would hear me straight, without drama, without telling me what I wanted to hear or what they thought I needed to hear. Dorothea has been my closest friend for nearly 50 years. She is sharp and honest, and she does not coddle. I sat in her living room, and I told her everything, and she listened, the way she always listens, completely, without interrupting. When I finished, she looked at me for a moment and she said, "Cordelia, what is your gut telling you?" And I said my gut told me something was wrong with this woman the day I met her. And she said, "Then you already know what you have to do." I went home and I called James Caldwell. James had been my attorney for years. He had handled Chester's estate and various small legal matters over the years. A man in his 60s now. Built his practice here in Harlan County. And knew this community the way only someone who has worked in a place for decades can know it. I called him at home because this could not wait for business hours, and James was the kind of man who understood that. I told him what I had found and what I suspected, and he listened, and when I was done, he said, "Come to my office tomorrow morning at 9 and bring your notebook." I sat in James's office the next morning and spread out my documentation, and he went through it carefully. He asked good questions, the kind that helped me organize what I knew versus what I suspected versus what was actual evidence. He told me that what I was describing if my suspicion was correct, was a serious federal crime. Identity theft with financial fraud across multiple institutions, the kind of thing that carried real prison time. He told me the process would be long and would require patience. He told me I needed to continue cooperating with the fraud departments and with law enforcement, and that he would help me make sure I was doing everything correctly from a legal standpoint. And then he said what I think is the most important thing anyone said to me throughout this whole experience. He said that the reason crimes against older people often go unpunished is not because the evidence is lacking, but because the victims do not pursue them, because they are embarrassed, or because they do not want to cause trouble, or because they have been made to feel somehow responsible for what happened to them, or because they are protecting someone. He said, do not let any of those things stop you, Cordelia. What was done to you was wrong and it deserves a real consequence. I told him nothing would stop me. The state police got involved when it became clear the case spanned multiple institutions in multiple counties. Detective Clara Rains was assigned, a woman in her early 40s, with a direct manner and a thorough mind that I respected immediately. She came to my house in March of 2021 and sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Priscilla had gone through my documents, and she went through everything with me. She was interested in the timeline above everything else. Every visit, every window of access, every conversation where financial information had come up. She was particularly interested in the September visit when Priscilla had been alone in my house for 3 hours. I gave her my composition notebook. All 4 pages plus what I had added since, which now filled 6 pages. Detective Rains looked through it for a long time without speaking. Then she looked up at me with something in her expression that might have been respect and said, Ms. Whitfield, this is very thorough documentation. And I said, Detective, I taught school for 41 years. Documentation was always part of the job. She told me they would be pulling Priscilla's financial history and looking for patterns. She told me to continue behaving normally, to not confront Priscilla or say anything to Roland until she gave me the green light. She told me that if Priscilla sensed the investigation, she might do things to complicate it, and we did not want that. I told her I understood completely. What she did not tell me, and what I found out later, was that within days of that first meeting, she had already started finding things. Because Priscilla's digital trail was not as clean as Priscilla apparently believed it to be. The devices used to submit the loan applications were traceable. Financial records showing deposits into accounts associated with Priscilla were retrievable. And there was something else. Something that Detective Rains found when she dug into Priscilla's history that was, in its way, the most clarifying thing of all. There had been a civil judgment against Priscilla in Tennessee in 2014. The details were in court records. A family member, a cousin who had trusted Priscilla enough to give her access to certain financial accounts for help with bill paying during a difficult period, had found that access used against her. Not exactly the same as identity theft, but close enough to show a pattern. The cousin had pursued it civilly, rather than criminally, and had won a judgment that Priscilla had apparently never fully paid. When Detective Rains told me this on a phone call in June of 2021, I sat in my kitchen and I thought about what it meant. It meant this was not impulsive. This was not a desperate person who made a terrible choice in a moment of crisis. This was a pattern. This was a methodology. This was something Priscilla had done before, to someone who trusted her before, and had apparently calculated that the consequences were manageable, enough to try again with a different target. She had looked at me and seen a target. She had invested months of friendship and warmth and carefully curated intimacy, and she had done it all in the service of a plan she had probably formed before. Roland ever brought her to meet me? That knowledge was harder to sit with than almost anything else in this experience. Not the money. The money was recoverable. What was harder was the understanding that every phone call, every warm afternoon conversation, every story I had shared about Chester and my mama and my childhood and my teaching years, all of it had been a resource she was mining. She had not been getting to know me. She had been conducting reconnaissance, acting normally through those spring and summer months of 2021, while the investigation was progressing was one of the hardest things I have done. I still talk to Roland every Tuesday. Sometimes Priscilla was there in the background and I could hear her voice. Sometimes Roland would mention something she had said or done and I would respond as naturally as I could manage. I focused on keeping my voice steady and my words simple, and I got through those calls one at a time. There was one particular Tuesday in May that I think about still. Priscilla got on the phone herself because Roland had stepped away for a moment. She was warm and easy, and she asked how my garden was coming in, remembered that I had been planning to put in a new row of beans, asked if the late frost had damaged anything. She remembered these details because she had listened carefully when I told her, because listening carefully was part of the work she was doing. I answered her questions about the garden, and I asked about her week. And I said goodbye when Roland came back and took the phone. And after I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time thinking about performance, about how it is possible to become so skilled at performing. Warmth that even when you know it is a performance, you almost cannot distinguish it from the real thing. Almost. There was another Tuesday in July, a hot evening, and I was tired from the garden and I was not at my best. And Roland mentioned that he and Priscilla were thinking about coming to visit in the fall, and my heart did something complicated in my chest that I had to very carefully manage, because the investigation was still in progress, because Detective Rains had told me to act normally, because bringing Priscilla to my house in the fall while the case was building would have been, to put it delicately, a challenge for my composure. I said carefully that the fall was a good time of year down here and that I would love to see Roland and that we should talk more about it closer to the time. And then I changed the subject and got through the rest of the call and hung up and sat in my kitchen in the summer heat and breathed. They did not end up coming that fall. The arrest happened in August and changed all of those plans for everyone. I want to say something about those months of silence, of acting normal, of carrying the knowledge without releasing it, because I think it speaks to something about character that does not often get talked about. It is easy to be honest when honesty is easy, when the truth you are telling will be welcomed, when it will not cause someone terrible pain, when it will not detonate something irreplaceable. Honesty costs you almost nothing. The hard version of honesty is when the truth you are holding will shatter something that someone you love has built their life around, when telling it will cost you more than staying quiet will, when you could look away from what you know and spend the rest of your years pretending you never knew it. That is when you find out what you are made of. I am made of the same stuff my mama was made of, and my daddy was made of, and Chester was made of. People who faced what was in front of them without flinching, not because they were fearless, because they understood that fear is not an excuse, that doing the hard thing is required not because it will be comfortable, but because the alternative is to become the kind of person who does not do hard things. And that is a kind of diminishment you can never fully undo. Detective Rains called me in late June to tell me they were ready to move toward charges. She said the digital evidence was solid, the financial records were solid, and the pattern established by the Tennessee civil judgment strengthened the case significantly. She told me she wanted to give me the chance to speak with Roland before anything official happened. She said she was not obligated to do that, but she thought it was the right thing. I told her I appreciated that more than she knew. I want to tell you about working with Detective Rains over those months because she deserves to be fully part of this story. She was methodical in a way that I recognized and respected, the kind of methodical that comes from genuine discipline rather than just procedure. Every time she came to my house or called me on the phone, she had done her homework before the conversation. Here is what I want you to understand about skilled manipulation. It does not announce itself. A person who is truly skilled at using other people does not come in wearing the face of a villain. They come in wearing the face of exactly what you need them to be. They study you, sometimes for months, and they become whatever version of themselves will make you trust them most. They are warm when you need warmth. They are interested when you need to feel interesting. They remember the things you told them because those things are data points, and they reference those things back to you in ways that make you feel seen and known and cared for. The whole architecture of the relationship is built on what They have learned about your needs and your vulnerabilities and your particular kind of loneliness. And the cruelest part of it is that the better you are as a person, the more open and trusting and willing to love, the more effective the manipulation is against you. It is not the suspicious and closed-off people who get targeted this way. It is the warm ones, the ones who believe in people, the ones who still, at 87 years old, wake up in the morning willing to think well of the world. Priscilla was not a genius. She was not some criminal mastermind. She was a person who had found a particular method that worked on a particular kind of target, and she had practiced it enough to become very good at it. The method was simple at its core. Find someone lonely. Find someone she never asked me to repeat something she had already documented. She built on what she had rather than starting over. Which sounds like a basic professional standard, but which, in my experience of dealing with various systems over 87 years, is rarer than it should be. She also treated me like a person of full intelligence and full credibility. I want to say that plainly because I am aware that older people reporting crimes do not always receive that treatment. There is a tendency, sometimes from well-meaning people, to be slightly more patient than necessary, slightly more explanatory than necessary, in a way that communicates an underlying assumption that the older person might be confused or unreliable. Detective Raines never did that. She spoke to me the way she would have spoken to any credible witness, and she listened to what I said with the full attention of a professional who intended to act on it. That mattered. She told me in one of our later conversations that my documentation had been unusually thorough, that the composition notebook had been genuinely useful in establishing the timeline, and that the detail and precision of my recollections had made her investigation significantly more efficient. She said she wished more witnesses documented things the way I had. I told her that 41 years of keeping classroom records was apparently good preparation for being the victim of a crime, and she laughed, which was one of the few moments of genuine lightness in that whole long process. There were harder conversations with her, too. She had to ask me questions about my own behavior, my own possible contributions to the situation, not accusatorially, but as a matter of thoroughness. Had I ever given Priscilla my social security number directly? Had I ever signed any document I did not fully read? Had I ever authorized anyone to act on my behalf financially? Had I shared passwords? Had I allowed anyone access to my online banking? I answered every question, honestly and completely, and I did not feel ashamed of any of my answers because the answers were all truthful, and the truth was that I had done nothing wrong except trust a person who did not deserve trust. That is not a crime. That is not a failure. That is what it is to be a human being in relationship with other human beings. The hardest question she asked me was whether I had any reason to believe Roland might have known what Priscilla was doing. She asked it carefully, and she apologized in advance for having to ask it, and she explained that she had to ask it as part of the investigation's due diligence. I told her I understood completely. I told her that no, I had no reason to believe Roland had any knowledge of it, that everything I knew about my son's character and his genuine distress when I told him made that seem essentially impossible, and that if she needed to investigate that angle independently, she was of course free to do so, but that I was confident in my answer. She told me that their investigation had found nothing to suggest his involvement, and that she had asked the question only because she would have been remiss not to. I appreciated her honesty about why she was asking. In the end, the evidence came together the way real evidence does, not in one dramatic revelation, but in an accumulation of pieces, each of which pointed in the same direction. The digital trail, the financial trail, the timeline, the prior civil judgment, the verification call that someone purporting to be me had made to one of the lenders. All of it adding up to a picture that was clear and was pointing at one person, and that person was Priscilla Dawn Sutton, my son's wife, who had smiled at me at a wedding and called me Mama and sat at my kitchen table and listened to my stories and used every bit of it. I called my son that evening. I asked him to find a private place to talk. There was a pause, and then I heard him move and close a door, and I thought about what was on the other side of that door, what he was about to hear, what it was going to do to him. and I felt a grief for my son that was separate from and deeper than any grief. I felt for myself, because I could handle what had been done to me. I am 87 years old, and I have survived things that were harder than this. But watching your child's world break apart in real time, hearing it happen over the phone in your kitchen while the evening light comes, through the window over the sink, that is a particular kind of pain. I told him everything. From the first letter to Beverly's office to the composition notebook to Detective Raines to what she had found. I told him about the Tennessee civil judgment. I told him about the IP address. I told him all of it completely because he deserved the complete truth and because nothing less than the complete truth would have been good enough for a moment that consequential. He did not say anything for a long time when I finished. The silence stretched out and I sat with it and I let him have it. Then he asked very quietly how long I had known. I told him. He asked why I had not called him right away, and I told him why. I told him I needed to be certain before I turned his world upside down. I told him I needed to hand him proof, not suspicion, because suspicion without proof would have hurt him and potentially damaged us and served no one. He cried. I heard it in his voice. The particular quality of a man trying not to cry and failing. My Roland who had cried rarely in his adult life, who had his daddy's steadiness. He cried and I stayed on the line and I did not fill the silence with words because sometimes words are not what is needed and I have been doing this long enough to know the difference. When he could speak again, he asked what was going to happen. I told him there was a criminal investigation and that charges were coming and that the evidence was strong. I told him he needed his own lawyer immediately. Not someone Priscilla knew or recommended or had any connection to. His own lawyer who was working entirely for his interests. I told him he needed to think clearly about his own situation, separate from hers, because from this point forward his interests and hers were in direct and fundamental conflict. He understood. Roland is a smart man, always has been, and he understood exactly what I was saying, even though what I was saying was the hardest thing either of us had ever said to each other in our lives. I also told him something else. I told him that whatever had been done to me and whatever was going to happen in the legal process, I needed him to know that none of what was coming was his fault. Not any part of it. I knew that he was going to spend time in the coming weeks and months asking himself what he had missed, what he should have seen, how he had let this happen. I wanted him to hear from me directly and without qualification that he was not responsible for being deceived by someone who had made a practice of deceiving people, that he had loved a woman who presented herself as worthy of that love. That being a person who loves openly and fully and without constant suspicion is not a character flaw, it is a virtue. And that virtue had been used against him in the same way it had been used against me, and neither of us needed to be ashamed of having possessed it. He was quiet after I said that. And then he said, "Thank you, Mama." Just that. "Thank you." And I said, "You never have to thank me for telling you the truth." He called me the next morning, having barely slept. I could hear it. And said he had already contacted a lawyer and had an appointment that afternoon. He also told me that he had confronted Priscilla the night before and told her what he knew. And she had denied it. Had looked him in the eye and said that I was confused. That I must have applied for those loans and not remembered. That my age and my isolation were affecting my memory and my judgment. She had been measured and firm and convincing in the way she always was when she needed to be convincing. And Roland told me that even knowing what he knew, even holding the facts in his hand, he had felt for a moment the particular disorienting wobble that a skilled liar can produce in someone who wants to believe them. He said that feeling, that brief wobble, frightened him more than anything else. Because if she could do that to him now, when he knew, what had she been doing to him for 2 years when he did not know? What had he been perceiving as their marriage that was actually something else entirely? I told him that was a question worth taking. To the therapist and not to himself alone. In a dark apartment. He said that was good advice. Priscilla was arrested in August of 2021, a Tuesday morning, which struck me as appropriate somehow. Roland was at work when it happened and found out from a colleague who saw something on the local news. He called me from his car in the parking lot of his office, and he was very quiet on the phone. He said they arrested her, Mama. And I said, I know they did. And we sat on the phone together for a few minutes, just being in it together. Across the distance between Harlan and Lexington, father and son in their respective silences. No, wait, I keep saying that. Roland is my son, not my husband. Chester was my husband. My Roland is my son. I apologize. The mind moves faster than the tongue sometimes at my age. Roland, my son, sat in his car in his office parking lot and called me, and we sat on the phone together. She was charged with 5 counts of identity theft and 5 counts of financial fraud. 1 count for each fraudulent account. Federal charges because the institutions involved were federally insured, which meant the case moved through the federal court system rather than state. James told me this was actually advantageous in terms of the seriousness with which it would be handled. The case moved slowly, the way legal cases do. Her attorney filed motions, requested continuances, explored various angles. She tried denial first, then claimed she had some kind of implicit permission for something that she never quite explained clearly, then argued the evidence was circumstantial. None of it gained traction. The digital evidence was very clean. The financial trail was very clear. And the Tennessee civil judgment, once it was introduced, established the pattern that prosecutors needed. My deposition was in November of 2021. I drove myself into Harlan that morning because I wanted to arrive under my own power. Not because I needed to make a point to anyone else about it, but because I needed to make the point to myself. I am Cordelia June Whitfield, and I drive my own car to the places I need to go. That has been true for 65 years, and it was going to be true on the day I gave a deposition in a case that was being brought on my behalf. I wore my good blue dress, the same dress I had worn to Roland's wedding. That was deliberate, too. I wanted to walk into that room as my full self, the woman who had loved and been fooled and fought back and who stood for something. The dress reminded me of all of that. I sat across a table from attorneys and a court reporter and a representative of the prosecution, and I answered every question I was asked clearly, completely, and honestly. I did not embellish and I did not minimize. I did not show off and I did not apologize for myself. When something was difficult to say, I said it anyway because difficulty is not an excuse for imprecision, and I needed my account to be precise. When Priscilla's attorney suggested that my age might affect the reliability of my recollections, he asked me a series of questions designed to test my memory. Specific dates, names of people involved, reference numbers from the loan documents, the exact sequence of events on various occasions. I answered every single one correctly and without hesitation. I am 87 years old and my mind is working just fine, and I wanted that established clearly on the record. Then I looked at that attorney across the table and I said I was a school teacher for 41 years. I know the difference between a genuine question and a test, and I know how to pass a test. James, sitting beside me, let himself have a very small smile at that. It was the only moment of lightness in an otherwise very serious room. After the deposition, James walked me to my car and he said, Cordelia, you did very well. And I told him I knew I had. Not out of arrogance. Out of the particular confidence that comes from telling the truth. You never have to second-guess yourself when you have told the truth. You never have to worry about what you might have said inconsistently or what you might have gotten wrong. You just told the truth, and that is the most solid ground there is to stand on. The case moved forward through the winter and into the spring of 2022. I will not pretend those months were easy. There was a period in January and February when I could not tell what was happening with the case, when communication was limited, because the legal process was in motion and James told me to be patient and trust the process. I am not by nature a patient person. I have gotten better at patience over 8 decades, but it has never come naturally to me. Those winter months were long, but the Kentucky winter is always long, and I have survived every one of them, and I survived that one too. Priscilla entered a guilty plea in the spring of 2022. Her attorney had done the math on what a jury trial was likely to produce, given the evidence and the pattern and the fact that her own words in various documented Communications had not helped her case, and the math had not favored trial. She pled guilty to 3 of the 5 counts of identity theft and 3 of the 5 counts of financial fraud in a negotiated agreement. She was sentenced to 4 years in a federal correctional facility, 3 years of supervised release upon completion of the sentence. Full restitution ordered for the $47,300 plus applicable interest and fees. Detective Rains called me when the sentence was handed down. She said I thought you would want to hear it from me directly. I told her she was right and I thanked her. Then I went out to my garden because it was a warm spring day and the beans needed attention, and I find that when I have big feelings, I do better with them when my hands are working. I knelt down in my garden and I pulled weeds for an hour, and I thought about justice, about what it is and what it is not. People have ideas about justice that I think are mostly borrowed from movies and television. In movies, justice looks like triumph. It looks like the bad person getting exactly what they deserve in a dramatic moment with music rising and the good person standing tall. The face of victory, the satisfying conclusion. Real justice is quieter and more complicated and considerably less cinematic than that. Real justice, in my experience, is a process. It is 16 months of careful, unglamorous, sometimes exhausting work. It is a 6-page composition notebook and a very thorough detective and a very good attorney and an 87-year-old woman who refused to be embarrassed into silence and who made every phone call and followed up on every phone call and filed every document and showed up to every meeting and gave her deposition with steady hands and clear eyes. It is the correct outcome arrived at, through means that nobody is going to make into a movie, through patience and documentation, and the willingness to stay in a difficult process long enough for the truth to finish being established. Real justice does not undo the wound. It cannot reach back into the past and unhappen what happened. It cannot return the months of worry or restore the sense of violation or ungrieve the loss of something I had thought was real. It cannot give me back the afternoon phone calls that I now know were calculated. It cannot make those stories I told feel unread, if that makes any sense. The things I shared with her I shared genuinely, and the fact that she was receiving them as data rather than as the gift I intended them to be does not change that I gave them genuinely. I cannot ungive them. I cannot get them back. What real justice can do is name what happened correctly, give it its right category. Say yes, this thing that was done was wrong, was criminal, was worth the full machinery of consequence. That matters, not because it fixes anything, but because truth matters. Because getting the category right matters. Because an 87-year-old woman's loss and violation deserves to be taken as seriously as anyone else's. And the fact that it was that Detective Rains drove out to my house and sat at my kitchen table and went through my composition notebook with professional care and filed her reports and built her case with the same rigor she would have brought to any case. That mattered to me more than I have words to fully express. That felt right. Not triumphant. Right. There is a real difference and it matters. Roland's divorce was finalized in early 2023. He had moved out of the apartment in July of 2021 and had been staying with a work colleague in Lexington while everything was sorted. The divorce process itself was surprisingly uncomplicated given the circumstances. There was not much to divide. They had not bought property together. Their finances had been separate in most respects. The marriage was short, and the ending, while painful, was at least clean in practical terms. What was not clean was the emotional accounting. Roland went through a period, in late 2021 and through 2022, that I watched with the particular helpless love of a mother who can see her child suffering and cannot do the suffering for him. He had not just lost a marriage. He had lost the version of his life he had believed he was building. He had lost the woman he had thought he was loving. And there is a specific grief that comes from discovering that a significant period of your life was built on something that was not what you believed it was. It makes you question your own judgment. It makes you wonder what else you have misread. It is deeply disorienting in a way that goes beyond the specific loss. He went through an anger phase which was necessary and which I let him have. He was angry at Priscilla, which was completely reasonable. He was angry at himself, which was less reasonable but which I understood. And there were a few conversations in the fall of 2021 where I could hear underneath the anger a question he was not quite asking out loud, but that I could feel the shape of, which was whether he should have listened to whatever reservations I had had about Priscilla from the beginning. Whether if he had paid more attention, been less in love, been more suspicious, none of this would have happened. I shut that question down every time I felt it coming. I said, Roland, you loved a woman who presented herself as worthy of love. You trusted someone who spent months earning your trust specifically so she could exploit it. There is no version of being a good person that protects you completely from that. If you spend your whole life suspicious enough to never be deceived, you will also spend your whole life too, suspicious to love anyone. And that is not a life I want for you, and it is not a life you should want for yourself. What happened to you was not a consequence of loving too much. It was a consequence of someone else's choice to be dishonest. Those are different things. He argued with me about that a few times. He is stubborn in the way that people who have had something taken from them can become stubborn about their own culpability, as if accepting blame for something that was not your fault is a form of penance. I understood the impulse even as I kept pushing back against it. Eventually, he started to hear me. Eventually, he started to actually hear me. He called me on a Sunday afternoon in the spring of 2022. 6 months or so into therapy, and he said, Mama, I think I am starting to understand what you have been trying to tell me. He said I asked my therapist about it, and she said something that really helped me. She said the question to ask is not why did I trust someone who turned out to be untrustworthy. The question to ask is what do I do now with what I have learned, without letting it take away the parts of myself that are actually valuable? And I told him, yes, Roland, that is exactly right. That is the right question. I was proud of him for getting there. I tried to be present for him in the way that a good parent is present, which is without agenda and without condition. Not helpful in that pushy way.
That is really about the
parents need to see the child. Okay, and not the child's actual needs. Just available. Just consistent. I brought food when he would let me. I called when he wanted to talk, and I did not call when he needed quiet. I did not say terrible things about Priscilla to him even when I very much wanted to, because he was hurting. Enough without me adding fuel to it, and because I knew from experience that children of any age need to be allowed to move through their own feelings about a person, without their parent directing the traffic of those feelings. He would find his own way to the conclusion that she was someone who had caused real harm and who deserved the consequences she received. He did not need me pushing him toward it. He is getting there. He is, as I said, doing better in the real sense of that word. Not better as in the subject has been dropped. Better as in the wound is healing, becoming a scar rather than an open thing, something that will always be part of his story. But that is no longer the loudest thing in the room. He started seeing a therapist in the fall of 2021, and I consider that one of the wisest decisions my son has ever made. He has been going consistently, and it has made a visible difference. Not in making him happy in a surface way, but in making him more solidly himself, more at ease with who he is and what happened and where he is going from here. That is worth more than happy. He came to Harlan County for Christmas of 2022, a year after the sentencing, and we sat in my kitchen on Christmas evening, after dinner, and we talked for 3 hours the way we have not talked since he was maybe in his 20s really talked. No performance and no careful management of what we were saying to protect each other from what we were feeling. He asked me how I had known something was wrong from the beginning. I told him honestly that I had not known, not exactly. I had felt something and I had chosen to override that feeling in favor of his happiness and his judgment about his own life. He asked if I regretted that choice. I thought about it carefully before answering. Then I told him no. I told him I would make the same choice again. I told him that loving someone means trusting their right to make their own choices about their own life, even choices you have quiet reservations about, because the alternative is not love, it is control, and I have never wanted to be that kind of mother. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "But you stopped her. Mama, when there was something concrete to act on, you stopped her. You followed it all the way through. And I told him yes, I did. Because when the truth is clear and the evidence is real, you follow it wherever it goes. Those are two different things. Respecting someone's choices and holding people accountable for crimes are two different things. Both can be true. I want to tell you what my life looks like now, in the spring of 2024, because I think the ending of a story matters as much as the beginning, and because I want you to understand that this story does not end with the sentencing. The sentencing was a chapter ending, not the book ending. The book ending is still being written. One morning at a time, one cup of tea at a time, one Thursday lunch with Dorothea at a time. My credit score was restored. It took just under a year of paperwork and follow-up, calls and dispute letters and conversations with Beverly at the bank, but every fraudulent account was removed from my report and my score went back to where it had been. The process was tedious and sometimes exhausting and required more patience than I sometimes felt I had. But I have spent 87 years building things that required patience, and this was no different. There is something I want to say about that restoration process that I have not fully said yet. It was not just the credit that needed restoring. Something else needed restoring too. Something harder to measure than a credit score, but just as real. I had had my identity taken from me. Not just my financial identity, though that was part of it. My actual identity, the record of who I was as a person, had been used by someone else as a costume to wear for financial gain. Someone had been Cordelia June Whitfield in those loan offices and on those verification calls, had used my name and my social security number and the facts of my life that I had shared in good faith, and had walked away with $47,000 and left the wreckage in my name. That violation went deeper than money. Restoring my credit was necessary. But restoring my sense of myself as the owner of my own story, my own identity, my own life, was also necessary. And that took longer, and was a quieter process that happened mostly in my own mind and heart over many months. I am pleased to tell you that it is complete. I am Cordelia June Whitfield, fully and without qualification, and I am the only one. My house is still mine, still sitting at the end of Clover Creek Road, just like it has since 1978. The oak tree in the backyard is enormous now, has been growing since Chester and I put it in the ground as a sapling in 1982. And on summer evenings when the light comes through it in a particular way, it is about the most beautiful thing I know how to look at. I drink my morning tea at the kitchen table every day, the same table that has held so many of the significant moments of this story, and I am glad to be at it. Some mornings, I sit at that table and I think about all the things that have happened at it. The Thanksgiving when Priscilla sat across from me and helped sort my documents. The morning I read the first letter from the Cincinnati bank. The afternoon Detective Raines sat across from me with my composition notebook. The evenings I talked to Roland, on the phone during the long months of waiting for the case to move forward. The table has absorbed all of those mornings and evenings, and it is still here, and I am still here, and the tea is still good, and the light still comes through the kitchen window the way it always has. I planted a new variety of tomato this year that Dorothea recommended. A heritage variety that is supposed to be particularly flavorful. My beans are coming in well. The marigolds along the border are bright, orange and yellow, and they make me happy every single time. I look at them, which is the exact effect my mama intended when she started planting them 60 years ago. Some things you inherit that are worth inheriting completely. Dorothea and I still have lunch on Thursdays. We have been doing that for decades now, the day and the habit both surviving everything that life has thrown at us and at the world around us. We have talked through more at those Thursday lunches than I could begin to catalog. Illnesses and deaths and family troubles and community struggles. And the slow changing of a county we have both loved our whole lives. Last Thursday she made chicken and dumplings and we ate at her kitchen table and talked for 2 hours, and I drove home feeling the particular fullness that comes from real friendship, the kind that has been tested by time and by trouble and that is held. Roland is doing better in the real sense of that word, not the sense people use when they mean they have stopped talking about something. He sounds lighter on the phone. He went on a weekend trip with some colleagues in the fall, and he called me from there, laughing at something one of them had said, and the laugh was genuine, unguarded, the kind that comes from being present in your own life rather than managing it from a safe distance. That is the sound I have been waiting for. I think about Priscilla sometimes. Not often, not obsessively, but sometimes. I wonder whether the person who called me those long afternoons and asked about Chester and listened to my stories was entirely fabricated, or whether there was some sliver of genuine connection mixed in with the calculation. I will never know. I have made my peace with not knowing. What I know is that what she did was wrong, and that it had real consequences for a real life, mine, and that holding her accountable for that was the right thing to do regardless of whatever complexity might or might not exist in the full picture of who she is. I also think sometimes about what her life looked like from the inside. I am not saying this to generate sympathy for her because sympathy is not what I feel, but I have spent 87 years teaching children and watching human beings, and I have some understanding of how people arrive at the choices they make. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to become the kind of person who preys on elderly women. That is a path that gets walked gradually, a series of small rationalizations, and small compromises and small decisions that each seem manageable in the moment, but that accumulate into something dark and consequential. Something went very wrong somewhere in Priscilla's life before she ever walked into Roland's life or mine. I do not know what it was, and I do not need to know. But I think about it sometimes. I do not feel sorry for her. I want to be clear about that because it would be easy to perform a generosity. I do not quite feel, and I have spent 87 years trying to be honest, even when honesty is not the most comfortable option. She looked at an old woman living alone, and she saw an opportunity, and she spent months carefully cultivating that opportunity with practiced warmth and manufactured intimacy, and she did it knowing exactly what she was doing. That deserves a consequence, and it got one. What I do feel sometimes in quieter moments is a kind of sorrow that is less about her specifically and more about what her existence in this world says, about a broader truth, which is that there are people among us who see other people's loneliness and trust and love as resources to extract rather than things to honor, that there are people who have made a practice of finding the lonely and the trusting and the elderly and using precisely the things that make those people good, their openness, their warmth, their willingness to let someone in as the tools of the crime. That sadness goes beyond Priscilla. It is a sadness about what some people are willing to do to other people and about the particular vulnerability of older people who live alone, who have things worth taking, and who want very badly to be loved. I want to say something directly to anyone listening who is older, who lives alone, who might be in a situation similar to mine. Not to make you afraid, not to make you suspicious of everyone who shows you kindness, but to say this clearly because I wish someone had said it to me. Be careful with your documents. Be careful with your personal information. Be careful about who you leave alone in your house and with your papers. Not paranoid, just careful. There is a difference between being loving and open and being careless about the practical realities of protecting yourself. You can be warm and you can be trusting and you can let people in, and you can also lock your important documents away and not confirm financial information to anyone over the phone and monitor your credit report regularly. Those things are not in conflict. You can do all of them at once. I monitor my credit report now every month. Beverly showed me how to set up alerts, and I have them set up. If anything opens in my name that I did not authorize, I will know about it within 24 hours. That is a change I made, and I am glad I made it. The barn door is firmly shut now, and even though the horse is already gone, I intend to keep it shut from here on out. That sadness I carry does not make me smaller. I have decided that. I carry it alongside everything else, and I keep going, full and open and present, because that is the only way I know how to be, and the only kind of life I consider worth living. Because here is the thing I keep coming back to at the end of this whole experience. It would be very easy after something like this to close down, to stop letting people in, to treat every new warmth with suspicion, to keep the door a little more firmly shut than it was before. And I understand the impulse. I genuinely do. When you have been fooled by someone you cared about, the most logical response might seem to be to care about fewer people, or to care more carefully, with more walls up and more distance maintained. To protect yourself from the next Priscilla by becoming the kind of person who is harder to reach. But I am not going to do that. I refuse to do that. Because the version of me that closes down and stops trusting is a version of me that lets Priscilla win in a way that is deeper than the money. She can take $47,000 in my name and I will get that fixed. But if she takes my willingness to be open, to let people in, to be the kind of person who sits at a kitchen table and shares stories and believes that the person listening actually cares, that is a loss I cannot fix. That is a loss that is mine and mine alone to decide to accept or not accept. I choose not to accept it. I am still here on Clover Creek Road. My door is still open to people who deserve it. My kitchen table still has room for someone to sit across it from me and talk. I am 87 years old and I have been on this earth long enough to know that the bad things that happen to you do not have to define the shape of the life you live afterward. You take what happened, you look at it clearly, you do what the truth requires, and then you get up and you keep going, full and open and present, because that is the only kind of life worth living. Chester would have agreed with me about that. Actually, Chester would have said it differently. He would not have said it in words at all. He would have just been in his workshop out back, fixing something that needed fixing, and he would have looked up when I came out and nodded, the way Chester always nodded when he was in agreement with something he thought went without saying, and I would have sat down on the old stool he kept out there, and we would have been in the workshop together in the late afternoon light, him working and me watching, and we would not have needed to say a single word about any of it because after 49 years we had gotten past the point where everything important needed to be said out loud. Some things could just be understood between two people who knew each other all the way down. I miss that more than I have words for. I miss being known that completely, but I carry it with me, and that carrying is its own form of it still being present in my life. Chester is gone, but he is also not fully gone because everything he gave me is still here. The values and the memories, and the steadiness he modeled and that I have tried to practice every day since I lost him, that is what love leaves behind when it is done right. Not just grief, but also everything the love built, which outlasts the grief eventually if you let it. I am telling you this story because it is true and because truth matters and because I believe that stories told honestly can be useful to someone who needs them. Not in the self-help way of here is what you should do, and here is the lesson, but in the human way of here is what happened to a real person and here is how she got through it. And maybe some part of that is something you can use in your own life, whatever you are facing. I am telling you this story because I am 87 years old and I am still here and I still have things to say. Because people sometimes treat older age as the end of a person's usefulness, as the beginning of a long, quiet decline into irrelevance. And I refuse that framing with everything I have. I have been on this earth for 87 years, and every single one of those years taught me something. And I am still learning, and I still have things to contribute, and my voice still matters. And so does yours, and so does the voice of every older person sitting in a house somewhere right now thinking that the world has moved on past them. It has not. You are still here. That means you still matter. Act accordingly. Now I want to hear from you. Tell me where you are watching from. Drop your city in the comments right down below this video. And if this story moved you, if it made you pick up your phone and think about calling somebody you love, if it made you think about the grandma or the granddad in your life who is sitting somewhere right now with a lifetime of stories in them and a heart that is bigger than you, probably go call them. Go visit them. Sit across a table from them and let them talk. Because you will not always have that chance, and the day you realize that is the day you wish more than anything that you had taken it when it was there. If you love your grandma, if you believe that older people deserve dignity and protection and justice when someone wrongs them, you know exactly what to do with this video. Like it. Share it with someone who needs to hear this story today. And subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. Because, honey, I am 87 years old and I have got a whole lifetime of stories left to tell. And I am not done yet. Not by a long shot.